And with that, I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker for today, John Meredith, who is the Head of Education and Outreach for Understanding Animal Research. This is a not-for-profit membership organisation which promotes a better understanding of how and why we use animals in medical science. John has been with UAR since its formation in 2008, having previously established a nationwide schools programme on animal research for the Coalition of Medical Progress. And before that, he had a career in educational publishing with Oxford University Press. Chiefly, he works with volunteers drawn from the research and animal technician communities to deliver talks to secondary schools in the UK, and also to develop the skills and resilience required to engage openly about the use of animals in research, both in formal and informal environments. And so with that, I'd like to say welcome, John, and over to you.
Thanks for the introduction, Charlotte. Just to recap very slightly, yes, I work chiefly with schools, so in education and outreach. So what I'm going to be talking today, what I hope I can share with you today is some of the sort of observations and ideas that we have learned over the years by spending a lot of time with young people, but also with people like you, thinking about how best to present this idea of animal research without the undue heat. So how to try, what we usually say is try and change from an argument into a conversation, to make it more of a conversation. I'll just make some general remarks about what I'm going to do, and I've already taken up some of your time. We're going to try and finish early enough for everyone to have plenty of questions, but the aim today is to share some of the insights that we have learned from spending a lot of years talking about animal research with the general public, mostly with young people in schools, but also with people like you, helping them, we hope, prepare to talk to people in schools and elsewhere. Now, what I want to look at is some of the public opinion about animal research in the UK, what we know about that, have a think about how that might shape the kind of messages that we can usefully take out to people about animal research, where their sort of focus is, how we can make a message that's easily landed. Think a little bit about what our intentions are when we communicate and what that should tell us about the way we go about this. I was going to look at some of the sort of like the sort of basic information that we should probably all share about animals, and that is sort of provides a sort of like bedrock of a lot of the sort of factual communication we do. And I was going to end up by looking at some of the kinds of challenges that we get, and just having a few thoughts about how to address some of the more challenging challenges, not necessarily aggressive, but some of the things that when you're trying to think on your feet aren't always obvious. Now, there are a lot of those. I'm just going to look at a couple to give us a sort of flavor of how that might go. That's the that's the presentation. Thank you very much, Charlotte. Do I have control of that, or do I need to talk to you? Let me see.
If you just tell me next slide, I'll be able to click through.
Oh, okay. I've just requested control, but okay. If you can
perfect.
And I'll see if that's going to work. Okay, so just very quickly, I think I'm not sure actually, but perhaps you do know what UAR is, but just to recap very quickly what Charlotte said, because I've already used some of your time. The idea of UAR is to work for our members with this aim to create a time when everybody understands the benefits that animal research brings to science and society. Now, that's the broad sort of like mission aim where we would no longer be necessary as an organization. That's the far distant one. And the thing I want you to notice about that, I've just lost this, Charlotte. Is it still showing for you? Yeah, what I want you to notice about that, what's going to underpin everything I say today, is that we don't have any conception of a time when everybody agrees that animal research is acceptable, or agrees that animal research causes no harm, or agrees that the animal research is on balance scientifically justified. What we're looking for is understanding that there is a positive, well-considered, ethically considered view that underpins the use of animals, and that's a much more realistic aim, and one which we think is comes close to something that we can achieve. And it's going to underpin all the ideas we have about how to engage people in the public. These are our strategic aims. I work mostly in the area of engaging the public and helping people to think about better ways to engage the public. But everything tends towards the third one, which is shaping a supportive environment for the people who are all our colleagues who are working with animals in the UK. So we are UK based, I should say. Of course, we were one of the founding organisations in the Concordat on Openness. Most of you will know about that. Signatories are committed to these 4 commitments, and I tend to be encouraging people and trying to help them with commitment number 3, being proactive in ways to engage with the public. So to begin where I said I would begin, I just want to have a little look at some of the public attitudes to animal research in the UK. Now, we have in the past, it hasn't run in the COVID period, but we have been part of the Moria survey on public attitudes. And the way this works is that general statements are given to the respondents, and they're asked to indicate the degree to which they agree with these statements, whether they strongly agree, strongly disagree, and so on, across the spectrum. Our questions on animal research are part of a broad survey. They're not sequential, so they're dotted around. So the idea is that we're going to get people sort of like snap impressions of how they sort of feel about animal research. And I think it's given us a good picture over time about the standing of animal research in the UK. I'm just going to give a couple to you. Now, you can play along at home. I don't expect you actually to jump in, but just think how you would respond to these statements. Here's the first one. I accept the use of animals for all types of research where there's no unnecessary suffering to the animals and there's no alternative. It's a little bit baggy, it's a little bit long, but you get the idea. Now, just think to yourself for a moment, where, if you had to say strongly agree, strongly disagree, somewhere in between, mildly agree, mildly disagree, just think about where you might be and why. And why. You might expect everybody who's involved in animal research scientifically to be on the strongly agree side, but of course, a whole lot of things, when you start talking about this, suddenly come in to make this statement a little bit more nuanced. Very often, people in the industry take me up on all types of research. What does it mean? Does it include cosmetics? Does it include trivial sort of research? Well, we don't know. What do we mean by animals? All animals which are regulated in some way. It's not said. What do I mean by unsaid? None of these things are said. So we can't assume that these are being going into much details in the general public, but they're things we should think about, of course. So you've thought about where you stand on this. Where might you expect the general public to stand? And I'm going to show you. This is the response we got in the last time this survey ran. It is still a surprise to me that strongly and tend to agree is very dominant in answer to even a statement as unsophisticated or with as little nuance in it as this one on animal research. In the United Kingdom, there is a very strong tendency to support the use of animals of scientific research in the terms I've just expressed. Much more strong, actually, than when I talk to people in the industry about this, because people in our business tend to be concerned about these questions about what do I mean by all types of research? What do I mean by all animals? Public doesn't seem to be too concerned with that straight off as a snap reaction. So what does this tell us? It tells us that when we're engaging with the public, some of that defensiveness that we may have experienced in the past, that sense that we are talking about a very unpopular subject to people who are hostile to us, who are judging us in a hostile way, is probably incorrect. That 6 and 8 at the far right in the reds, who are strongly opposed to animal research, well, they're there and they're very loud and they're not likely to change their mind in conversation with people like us, but they do not dominate public opinion. And it means, I think, that we should be a little bit more secure when we're talking to general audiences about this subject, and be a bit more secure about the likelihood that we're going to be getting a positive reception. Here's another statement. There needs to be more work done into alternatives for using animals in scientific research. How would you answer that? Just thinking in your head? And then ask yourself, do you think you're on the side of public opinion in that? Where would you imagine the public response to be in a statement like that? Well, you probably guessed it. Given that statement, the public strongly agrees. They don't know what alternatives are. They don't know how much we're already doing. Not everybody in the business does. But they strongly feel that we ought to be looking for alternatives. And I'm guessing that most of you were in the green band of this as well. So we support the use of animals and animal research with a lot of caveats. And we're looking for alternatives. The views from the industry and the views from the public are actually more closely aligned than we think. And that's I think that is helpful towards helping us shape the way our messaging should go. Here's another one. I've just got two more of these. How about this one? It's acceptable to use animals in all types of research where there's no alternative. It's very light where we started, but it's not the same. Just give it a little think to yourself whether you would respond differently to this question than you did to where we came in. Just think where you came in right at the beginning. Were you thinking, yes, strongly agree, somewhere in between? Then ask yourself where you think the general public's going to be. Well, why should they be any different? Some of you will have spotted what the key difference is between these two statements, but some of you may not have done. And remember, our respondents aren't being primed. They're not seeing these in order. These are dotted around about questions about completely different topics. And it's what we get. In a moment, we should. In a moment, this is going to change slide. Yeah. Sorry, it's fidgeting a bit. Yeah. So we get a big change. Now we get a big change between this and the first slide. Look how many more now there are towards the right-hand side of this graph into the red, so that into the tending to and strongly disagreeing. And what's changed? Well, the only thing that's changed, only substantial thing that's changed, is we don't make any comment about suffering. Okay, so there's no mention of suffering in the second one of these statements. Now remember, once more, these aren't people being primed. This is just snap reactions to a statement amongst many other sorts of statements. It suddenly seems obvious that while there is a sort of instinctive support for the use of animals in principle, in theory, in the country, amongst the UK population, the question of suffering makes a big difference to how that's received. And whether we address the question of suffering is going to make a big difference to how that's received. I mean, even so, I have to say that there's 39% of people are still agreeing, even with a statement like that, even a statement as bold as that, will still be willing to strongly or tend to agree with the use of animals in medical research. So, we're not dealing with the wall of hostility that we may want to imagine, but it seems to me it becomes clear that if our message is going to land well with the public, we need to be not only representing the case of animal research, we have to be addressing this question of suffering. That is something that we need to be bringing into the conversation. And maybe in the past we've wanted to put that a little bit to one side or let it come up in questions. If we lead on in with these ideas, we're much more likely to be more positively received. Note as well, though, it said in the first slide, no unnecessary suffering. It didn't make any unconditional claims about removing suffering. It didn't say anything that we can't support, but it is about unnecessary suffering. So the public's attitude towards suffering in animal research with animals is not without nuance. One last one. Doesn't bother me if animals are used in experimentation. It doesn't bother me. Are you bothered? Ask yourself if someone says, are you bothered? How would you respond? My guess is most of you are thinking, I'm bothered, and that you don't think that there's a contradiction in defending the use of animal research and being bothered or concerned about it, because being bothered just indicates that you consider the animals to be of moral consequence, of moral interest. And I would agree with that. When we put a statement like this to the public, and again, I wouldn't be at all surprised if this is what you anticipated. The disagree means they are bothered here. So, I mean, actually 20% say they're not bothered at all, but most people here are bothered where they care at all about animal research. So even though where we came in, we seem to see a public that is willing to support animal research, it is clear that they don't do it lightly. They are concerned and bothered. And one of the things that's obvious that they're bothered about from this sort of data is the question of suffering, is how we are taking care of those animals. So we probably defending the principle of animal research is probably not what we are being most invited to do, but to represent to people that it is possible to do animal research without unnecessary suffering. In other words, where we may have in the past, because of the conditions that we were entering into this debate in, which were very hostile 15, 20 years ago, we may have felt that we were principally being driven to try and defend principles of animal research from the bottom, so to speak. Sometimes we have to do that. We're invited to debates and things. Actually, people are less likely to be asking for our arguments. They're more likely to be asking for our reassurance, to reassure them that their initial position, which is broadly accepting, is valid, that they're entitled to it, because we're thinking about questions like um, alternatives, and we're thinking about the suffering that the animals experience. So all these things, this sort of background, uh, has helped us reconsider sometimes how we go forward with a message to the general public. And it's worth important. It's worth important. It's important to think exactly what it is that we are trying to achieve when we talk to the public about anything, but especially obviously about the subject of animal research. Are we trying to change their mind? No. We just are not going to change the mind of those six, that's sort of like 15% who are actively hostile to the use of animals in research, partly because some of them are simply beyond reaching, they're cranks, and we've maybe dismissed a lot of these people out of hand in the past, but more generally because they're thoughtful, committed, dedicated people who have um, a set of ethical principles which are different to the ones that we operate under, and we should respect that. But we're not likely to change their mind. Actually, sometimes we do, but we'll put that to the side. Typically, we're not likely to change their mind. And what happens if we try to? What happens if we bring our best arguments into to face them up? Those arguments aren't likely to turn them over. I mean, who does? Who changes their mind when they meet the best argument from somebody else? Instead, it invites people to dig into their prior positions, and we see this all the time in lots of areas of public life and controversy, and especially in animal research. We invite them to dig in. If instead we offer reassurance, if we set out to say, animal research is not as you imagined it, these are the realistic conditions in which it's done, these are the thoughtful people who do it, and this is how they embody their desire to, or enact their desire to remove animals from the process whenever they can. That reassurance can bring those people who might be just softly accepting of animal research, and allow them to hold that position with more confidence. So what we're trying to achieve when we engage with the public is their reassurance, not their persuasion, and that I think will change the messages that we bring to the floor. And I just probably I'm being very slow today, I'm afraid, Charlotte. Yeah. So these are realistic expectations we can have: reassurance, not persuasion, and better information. So we can always bring information, and whatever we offer about animal research is always going to be welcome, because whatever their starting position is, the conditions that animals are actually used in are going to be better. So wherever they start, and this is almost a law of engaging with the public about animal research, whatever we show them is going to be better than what they anticipated at the beginning. So bringing better information and being reassurance are realistic expectations, not bringing that argument. And honestly, you discover this very, very quickly with schools, because young people can be perverse, and they can see things as a game, and they can just not want to help you out. So you bring your killer argument and you say, you think, okay, I've got this analogy, this is going to knock them out. If you're in a life raft and you had to throw over the side, you had to throw the baby or the dog in order to save everybody's life. This is like animal research, right? What would you do? You'll get a whole class saying, kill the baby, and you just look like an idiot, and what do you do then? You're all liars. Well, that's not so great. But if instead what you're saying is, and trying to be sincere about this, by the way, not being too passive aggressive, I respect and understand your opposition, and it's legitimate, and in fact it's not even something which I 100% can refute, because we're in the area of ethics, but it's not mine, and this is the position we take, and we hope that you can understand as well that this is well thought about and considered. Then we can often make a difference. And I can say, by the way, I mean, we're always saying you're not in the business of changing people's minds, and it's true. But if you take the position that you're not, you will sometimes too. So it can be a win-win. So I'm trying to advance slides which are really not wanting to play ball, but we'll see in a second. So we're trying to reassure, but we do need to have key messages. And understanding what the key messages are that you need to get across are going to really help you shape whatever in any communication what you're trying to do. And there's a few things to be said about key messaging. Um, the first one is that there needs to be few. 3 messages is usually what is key points is usually the most that you can communicate in any, especially any verbal encounter with people, and the most that people can take away. If you have 3, they're going to protect you in just about any situation where you might be engaging with people, because this is what you can go to when all else fails. Here are 3 possible key messages about animal research that are very useful when I'm going out to speak to people. We can't have new medicines without animals, whether that's for people or for veterinary purposes. No animals can be used if there's an alternative. This is legal. Okay, this is the one point of law which I repeat in every engagement that I make. It's not well understood, and it's a very powerful point. Suffering and distress is always at a minimum. Not that we reduce it, but that we can minimize it, and that's going to need to be backed up. So I'm going to need to show some evidence for that. So what underlies all these key messages is whenever we can go to actual experience, and I know some of you will be working directly with animals, some of you won't, but whenever you can go to direct, real experience, that carries more weight than any amount of theoretical explanation. So suffering and distress is always at a minimum. For example, in my unit at the moment, this is what we're doing to keep our mice comfortable and to reduce any of their suffering or their distress. So these are 3 plausible key messages. They could change, of course, depending on your situation, or if you have any particular research area which you want to stress and the benefits that it brings. Some people want to put more stress on the legislative apparatus that protects animals. I think there's value in that, but it doesn't always carry the weight that we expect it to. It's very easy to dismiss out of hand. We say regulation, people say, yeah, that's just paperwork, right? Okay, it's understandable that people can be cynical about these things, but the one point, as I've said, that I do think lands is it's illegal to use animals where there are alternatives, because that speaks directly to the point which is made by some of our opponents in these discussions, who are saying they are choosing to use animals above the alternatives that they could use for profit or for laziness or through lack of intellectual curiosity. We're going to need some facts. I'm going to run very quickly over some of the slides which I use in schools to give you an idea of some of the sort of like the key facts that I always put at the top of a presentation. I think it's worth having an idea about what these are. It's worth spending time, if you're going to do any engagement in this area, in preparing a little bit of about the facts about the organization that you're working with, which animals use, the number of animals you use, broadly speaking, typically, and what you're doing to reduce that number. This is worth knowing specifically for your organization. And the fourth one, why? What is the human benefit, the potential human benefit of anything you work with? Now, I'm not sure who I'm talking to here, but it's probably different from some of my audiences. I sometimes am working with people who are in the technical side of preparing animals for research, and they say, well, that's not my sphere. But actually, we can all know that. We can all know that in my lab, in my company, these animals are being used for research into, they're research into a expression of a particular protein through a certain cellular pathway. But the reason for that is it may have something to do with whatever, pancreatic cancer that could save X number of lives in the future. Right? Understanding this picture is a very valuable preparatory sort of protection and armoring for you. This is a quiz I run. I'm going to run through this quite quickly because we're already a little behind, but it's which goes to the basic facts. The basic facts, I think, that is a good starting point for any conversation I'm going to have with people about animal research. You can answer the questions in your head. And actually, just keep a score. Put up in the chat at the end anybody who got 4 out of 4. But the first thing I always ask is, how many animal procedures are carried out, do they think, in the UK each year? Now this changes, so I've sort of kept it at this sort of like as a sort of standard of between 300,000 and 35 million. And the correct answer is around about 3 million. We know this goes up and down each year. So why is that worth mentioning? Well, it gives me 2 opportunities. for shaping the message that I'm going to put out, which I think make life better for me. First of all, I'm acknowledging ahead of the game that this is a significant cause for moral concern. It's a lot of animals, and we recognize that. We don't think that this is a trivial question. Most of these animals will be killed. So I'm getting in there first with something we'll come to in a moment, actually, with a key preoccupation with people, and I'm controlling the way that conversation can go, because that's something which is of real concern to people, and I can control that a little bit. You guys can often control it better because you're actually responsible for the deaths of these animals, and that gives you a different moral relationship to them. So I can control that by anticipating it. And it puts it into a context. Okay, it's a big number. Big numbers are impressive to people. And then of those animals, how many use it to test cosmetics? I wonder if you guys know, actually. I'm always surprised because this is not understood. Young people will never guess this. Oh, you'll get one or two brave souls. They simply do not know that we don't use animals to test cosmetics in the UK. And in fact, I'm typically talking to young people at the age of 14, but it goes from 14 to 18, and well, actually from 12 to 18, usually in secondary school, but around about 14 is the typical age. We haven't used any animals to test cosmetics since before they were born, since 97 in the UK. This is really not understood. We need to make sure that this is part of the conversation, I think, if we have the opportunity to put some information over. And what are cosmetics? Everything that's non-medical, shaving foam, lipsticks. It's not just the girls, or shampoos, moisturizers, sunscreens, chapstick, all those things which are non-medical. And obviously that's going to make a difference to the moral argument that we engage in later on. What proportion of these of research animals are monkeys? This slide even breaks my rule of not using percentages in any general public conversation. People that hate maths, but I think it's useful for the reasons I'm going to giving. The reason I raise it as monkeys is just because it's a small number, but it allows me to make the point that the species we use are not necessarily the species that they typically expect. If I ask you guys what's the most commonly used animal in medical research, I think you probably guess right. It's the mouse by a very large margin. It's something like 77 to 80%, depending on the year, of the animals we use are mice. But if I ask the general public, they do not generally go to that at all. I'll get rats, guinea pigs, rabbits. Sometimes I get not entirely serious contributions as well. So putting it in terms of the percentages of the monkeys, okay, percentages don't carry a huge amount of emotional weight with people, but it's a good opportunity for me, therefore, to talk more broadly about the kind of animals that I use. And drumming home that the animals we use are not necessarily the species they're considering can make a big difference to the way they think about this subject. We mostly use mice. In fact, animal research in the UK is almost about just mice. Okay, but then we got this other 30%, which includes, and they'll never guess that the second most commonly used animal is, actually, I don't think it was the last time we counted, but typically the zebrafish. And after that, we get rats and chickens, and that's 97%, 97, 98% of the animals on a typical year in the UK are those four species. Everything else is in that last 2%. Now, of course, that matters, but everything else is contained in that last 2%. And that gives me the opportunity to talk about why that might be and bring us on to some more complicated questions. And that's with this last slide. This last question: which of these species is not used in medical research? Well, you guys will probably know, or that it's chimpanzees. It's not well phrased, actually. It's which species are we not permitted to use in the United Kingdom or the EU? Just about everything I've said is true of the EU as well, I think, yeah. But we talk about the United Kingdom so that we can be confident. We can use any species that is not protected, that is bred for the purpose, and is below the great apes in terms of their, as I would say, their cognition, their mental life, if you like. And that's by law. So by law, we're required to push down, and now we're talking about the 3 R's and regulation, but in terms that I think is a little bit easier for general audiences to grasp, which is which animal are you allowed to use? Taking the view that when we use lower order animals, if we use a fly instead of a goat instead of a monkey, we reduce the possibility of suffering. Not everyone's going to agree with that. If you're pushed back on a question like that, this is where you need to remember what your job is. It's about reassurance and not about persuasion. If someone says, I think that's an absurd over theoretizing, of what it means. I have had challenges like this, even from children. Maybe not in exactly those terms, but that's a sort of theoretical framework which ignores the actual experiential position of what a relation of an animal to its life. So that is a an intelligent, thoughtful challenge, but we don't take that view. We think it's plausible to say that using simpler creatures in terms of their mental life creates less, minimizes suffering, and the law embodies that and requires that we use the simplest species whenever we can. So that's a sort of these are the basic, I think, the fundamental bits of knowledge about animal research that we should be prepared to put out there. Um, uh, you might have, like I said, other specific things you need to talk about sometimes as well. But what happens then? What happens when we get sort of like pushback and challenges? Whenever I'm asking people to go and talk in classrooms as volunteers, this is the thing they tend to be most anxious about. Yeah, it's fine, I can do the presentation, but then they ask me questions. What am I allowed to say? What can I say? What should I say? It's not, and I actually think that's a mistake. This is the time when you're really going to have most fun once you understand a little bit about preparing for some of the sort of more left field or areas which can seem a little bit insecure. Come on, slide. Yeah, I really want you to look at that picture for a bit longer. So just going to finish up on some of the questions and challenges. Now, just 3 points very quickly to make general points. And that is that it's not actually hard, typically. You will know most of the answers. If you don't, it's okay. Okay, you're not standing. When you talk about animal research, you do not suddenly represent the whole of biosciences in the UK on this subject. And because we've had tend to have a little bit of a defensive position on this in the past, we've kind of felt that if we make a mistake here, we're letting down a whole side because we're in a fight. We're not in a fight. Most people already agree with us. They just want to be reassured. It's fine not to understand, not to know about everything. It's fine to say the piece of research you're describing doesn't sound good to me, but I don't know about it. I'd have to look into it. I can't defend the practice that you've heard going on in this lab. It sounds like it's against the law and it should be dealt with. You often find yourself having these conversations, but I can't defend that. If it is going on and you're right, then I would be against it too, all other things being equal and so on. So in most cases, it's simply about being open and honest. And I don't think if we are going to be sincere about openness as a means of creating a better, healthier environment for people working in this area, we have to we have to stump up on that. We have to really deliver on that. There is nothing that we cannot say. And I have seen people engaging with young people showing some images which are really test this, for example, and with extremely positive responses, because simply being honest, demonstrating that we're willing to look at the whole truth of this subject, is giving that reassurance that typically people are asking for. Some people will just reject it out of hand or be shocked and horrified by the images. Oh, we don't always have to show them shocking images. In classrooms, we're not really allowed to typically, but some in other formats we do, and sometimes bringing people into labs. Some people are going to reject it. Some of them are going to do it noisily. That is not. You haven't lost anything with that. Those are not the people you're expecting to reach, or that you're likely to. So all other things being equal, just be open and be honest. Offer reassurance rather than persuasion. Try and shrink back from finding yourself into in an argument. When you notice that you've got into a pattern of argument, some people are argumentative. I am personally, and it's very easy to find yourself being drawn into it. That's when you need to sometimes just put a stop, unless you're just happy and it's a comfortable, safe place. That's fine. And remember that you just say, look, this is our view. We don't expect it to be accepted by everybody, and speak from personal experience where possible. And this goes back to the point I was just making before. Generalized theoretical statements are much less persuasive than the voice that says, well, this is how it is for me. Well, I can tell you this. I don't I can't answer for everybody in the country doing this work, but this is how it is for me. But what happens when you get some of those questions which you really just think, all right, I know the answer, but can I possibly give it? Well, this is the most common question we get asked. As I said before, I tend to preempt it because it's such a common question. What happens to the animals afterwards? And what happens to the animals afterwards, typically in 9 times out of 10, is the animal is killed. It's not a welcome answer. Nobody wants to hear it. You'll lose sympathy of a crowd very often. That people will, you'll hear that that sucking in of air, but it's the truth. And we have to give the truth even when it's tough. Now, you may want to soften it a little bit. You may want to say, where possible, we can rehouse the animals, like higher order animals like dogs and monkeys, more typically, can be rehoused, but typically they have to be killed. Even when that's bad news, we have to put it out there. And I would even use the word killed. We usually say humanely killed, rather than being tempted towards a euphemism like euthanized, because you'd have to explain it anyway. So sometimes we have to be blunt, and sometimes it's good to anticipate these blunt answers by placing them in our communications earlier on. If I took you into a classroom and asked you to talk about this, when you get this question, because you certainly will at some point, very often the follow-up question is how, and you think, well, what are they after here? Are they challenging the ethical position here? I think very typically they're just curious. And then the next question is very often, have you ever done this? And there's a kind of excitement, a little frisson as well. So it's the purport, the import behind the question is not always what we think it is, and the reaction isn't always what you think of it. Sometimes it's just yuck. It's not a moral yuck. It's just a visceral yuck and shock. And then we get questions which are, I think, more challenging from a conceptual point of view. And this is the second most common question we get asked by every audience, by the way. This includes adult audiences, WI, children, TV, phone-ins, whatever forum we talk about this on, and we talked on them all. This is probably the most common question taken all in all. Why don't you use murderers or prisoners, rapists, whatever the group is instead? And it's not a straightforward question, and I don't have an answer for you, but you need to. Yeah, I bet you have, Sarah. You need to have an answer for this question. I think we need to understand what our answer is for this question. It basically goes to the heart of the ethical question about animal research. It's really saying, why do we make a moral distinction between using animals and using human beings when we do animal research? Is that an arbitrary distinction, as some ethicists would say, or is it something that is that we can make a plausible, rational point of view on? Now, I don't have the answer. I'm going to tell you what I say, but this is a position we need to take on it. What we say is, well, because murderers and rapists, whatever they are still humans, and in our society, we afford special moral protections to human beings in terms of rights. And we do that because we've seen what societies look like if we don't protect human beings above all, above other animals. The implication of that is, and you may get challenged on this, that we place a higher moral value on human beings than other animals, all other things being equal. And my answer to that is yes. That's where we come from, and that is our broad social position. If you want to test that, ask yourself, would it be acceptable to keep a person as a pet? Perfectly acceptable, generally thought to be acceptable to keep an animal as a pet, in the right conditions. Could we keep a person? No. That's because we put a different moral weight on the lives of humans than we do to all other animals. And I'm comfortable saying that. Many people will reject that, and not just uninformed people, some philosophers and ethicists too. If they do, this is exactly that point where you need to say, this is our position, and we think it's appropriate, we think it's defendable, but we don't think it's the only possible one. If you don't agree with it, if you think animals and humans are of the same moral value, you can't, of course, accept animal research. But understand that we don't do this lightly, we don't do this unthoughtfully. We think this is the position to go on. And there's lots of other sorts of versions of this question that you'll come across. So it's sort of wrapped up in lots of other distinctions. Sometimes it's just direct. Why is it okay to use animals when you wouldn't use a human being? We need to know what our answer to this is, and I don't think it's something that we've always considered in advance. These questions, I think, are in some ways the toughest. It's usually asked by someone. They can seem like challenges. They can seem hostile. How much do the animals suffer? I may have the next one here. Might be what's the worst thing you've ever done? Now, they can seem like they come from a hostile place. I think typically they're not. Typically, when someone asks a question like this, they're saying, well, you've told us it's fine. Well, not fine, but you've told us that you do a lot to minimize suffering and so on. But give me a picture for the whole story. And I think we have to be as honest as we can. But this isn't something which you can simply answer right with a direct question, because there are no sort of like standard measurements. So yes, we can talk about all the measures that are in place to reduce suffering and distress, whilst acknowledging that sometimes severe procedures do take place. But even then, and this is the point I think is often missed out by the general public, even then we are talking about suffering rather than pain. We can usually control pain. Suffering is are the other um, uh, effects on negative effects on the welfare of the animal that we're addressing, typically, not in every case, but typically. And finally, with this sort of question, it's really good place to go to actual lab experience if you can. So if you can say, okay, these are my general thoughts, but look, just to give you a picture, because I think this is typically what underlies a lot of these questions, is actually give me a picture. Just help me understand. I say, well, for example, the mice we're using on the current study we've got at the moment, this is what they will experience. This is what they will go through. And this is quite typical. And this is what they will feel. And that gives a sense of their life. So we move away from talking about suffering per se to just giving a life experience of the animal. And if we can do that in our written communications and our website communications as well. And it's the thing that we most often leave out. Just what is it like, as far as we can say, to be an animal in an animal unit, and that underlies an awful lot of questions and challenges we get. This sort of thing, I'm going to run on very quickly now. What's the worst thing you've ever done to an animal? Well, again, this can seem like a hostile challenge, but I don't think it usually is. It's worth knowing what your answer to this is. A lot of people say, well, it might be putting the animals down, that sort of thing. But my general point here is I would watch out for these words like worst, these words which have a sort of like secret moral cargo, which you can't necessarily control. You can't know what moral weight it's being given, it being contained in there by the person who's asking it. So when you get questions like this, think a little bit about whether you can reframe it slightly. So I would answer not as in what's the worst thing you've done, but the most severe procedure I've ever been involved with, to put it in a little slightly technocratic sort of way, or well, the moment I find most difficult or most stressful or is most upsetting for me. So use sort of more neutral language, and you put it in those terms. And if you've got examples of this sort of thing in your back pocket, so to speak, ready to pull out, that can protect you from when you get these then thinking on the stump and saying something which is, which you didn't mean to. You are allowed to protect yourself. I say be open and honest, but you are allowed to be a little bit self-protective, of course, when you're talking to the public. And finally, questions about your personal feelings. Do you feel guilty? This is another example of where you need to watch out for the frame. I think it's fine to talk about your feelings, even if they're negative. In fact, it's very powerful when people do. I've seen somebody say, I'm just doing this work with some mice on an array at the moment, and I'm not convinced we've got it right. And I feel really bad about it. It's keeping me up at night. Far from losing her audience with that, you could feel them leaning in towards her. So it's fine to answer these questions. Just watch out for the trap of the framing, like guilty. So if you say, yes, sometimes I feel guilty, the implication that some people are entitled to take from that is, therefore, I must think I'm doing something wrong. So just reframe it. Do you ever feel guilty? Well, I often feel very worried or concerned or upset or distressed about it, and put them into more neutral terms. So it's worth thinking about a little bit about the sort of framing. And if you get something which is just aggressive, how do you sleep at night? What sort of person can do this? People like you are disgusting. This is in a sort of verbal situation, or maybe on in social media as well. This is the time where you have to remember you're not in a fight. You're not going to reach this person. They don't want to talk to you. They just want to insult you, or maybe they just want to challenge you to be a bit kinder. And this is a good place where you should just have some boilerplate, which is, I always say something like, not everyone's going to agree about this. So you don't answer it facetiously. Yeah, I don't. How do you sleep? I sleep great. But have that boilerplate. This is a complex question. It's a complex thing, and we're not all going to agree. And but it's understandable that it excites really powerful feelings. And keep it really neutral. And obviously, if you're in a public situation, you can very often then bounce that along with any other questions. So gabbling a little bit at the end there. I'm sorry, but I ate into a lot of time at the beginning. So we've got 5 minutes left. If you have any questions or comments, I would love to hear them. Um, uh, and it's over to you, Charlotte. So I'm just having a look at the chat to see if there's anything there. By the way, we do slightly more involved versions of this live, which we're very happy to come to our members to do work on, especially if anybody's thinking about public engagement with animals or school work, which we're trying to revive a little bit now after the COVID years. Okay.
Whilst
Now,
that question, oh, sorry, whilst that question is incoming, I'll turn my camera back on. I was wondering what, at the start you talked about unnecessary suffering. I was
yeah,
wondering what, like, who defines unnecessary suffering? What does that really mean?
we don't define it in that particular statement, but if we're in our communications to what I think we should draw from it from communicating to the public is that we need to talk about suffering. We don't have to use the phrase unnecessary suffering. That's put in the Murray poll, but we need to talk about suffering. And I would avoid using phrases like unnecessary suffering as much as we can, and instead say we prioritize welfare. So we prioritize the animal's welfare, and these are the things that we can do to minimize pain, suffering, and distress. So analgesia is always given. So keep it as concrete as possible wherever possible, but emphasize that it is a that these animals are in a culture of care where everybody is focused, or it has as a major priority their welfare in this process, but without denying that we will sometimes do harms, and that's a legitimate moral question. Does that answer that, Charlotte? Does that?
Yes, I think it does. Thank you.
I mean, we're very happy to talk more about this if you have other thoughts after the meeting and you want to, or if you have a specific sort of like engagement you're thinking about or communication you're thinking about. I've got something here from Amy. Oh yeah, the cosmetics question, Amy. Yeah, it's interesting one actually. Is that no animal tested cosmetics may be sold or assembled in the UK if they after 97 and 2013 in the EU. So there may have been some slippage between those dates, but certainly since 2013. So no, it is a pretty robust ban, and it's likely to get tighter. There might be some grey areas here or there where companies have a sort of dual um, development process. So they're developing for one market with animals and another market without animals. But anything licensed into the EU must have been developed completely without animals, and that includes their ingredients. So you can't develop the ingredients separately and then assemble them. And I think it's probably going to get tougher as countries like China are beginning to look at this even too, and they've previously demanded quite a lot of animal testing before anything could be sold there. Sarah, you asking what are your messages was about no new meds without animal research. How do you counter that this is just a regulatory issue? Yeah, well, to some degree you can't counter the argument. So you can acknowledge that yes, okay, part of that is that we're required to use animals for safety testing before we do first in human, but then point out that that is not actually where most of our animals are used. And usually in a longer school presentation, this would be part of what I show them, the process of medicines. Most of our animals in the UK, it's not by a huge margin, but most are used in basic research. And basic research is actually where it's most difficult to see how we can replace animals, because we don't know very often we don't know what it is that we don't know. And that's what we're investigating in and that's why we need a complete, complex biological model. So that would be the answer I give. And remember, we're not in an argument. So not typically, I know sometimes we're invited to debates and we have to get a bit more punchy, but typically with the public communication, we're not in an argument. Someone says, well, I just don't think that's the case. You say, well, I can reassure you it's the case. In the work that we're doing, we can't do without the animals, and the law says that we mustn't use animals if they're replaceable. But don't try and persuade them, because if someone's just going to reject what you tell them, nothing you tell them is going to from then on is going to add to what they believe. Do we have any other thoughts? Well,
If that's all, I might just stop presenting for a moment so I can see you all again, if that's all right.
yeah, I've heard there are alternatives. Why don't people use them? Says Sarah. Is this a challenge that you've had, Sarah? I expect you have. Well, my answer to that would always be, look, the law requires us to use them if they're there, but I'm not naive. It's quite possible that some people have developed alternatives that other people aren't fully aware of or don't yet believe are thoroughly validated. There's always going to be some slippage, and we can always improve. So that's where I would leave that unless I was challenged with something very directly specific. This gets a lot easier when you're communicating on a controversial subject. Your position, you will be in a much happier and easier place once you accept that you do not have to be categorical in every answer. We can admit that there are weaknesses, there are failings, that things are probably not being done perfectly. The public already understands that, and they are what they're looking for is to be reassured that we are doing everything within reasonable bounds that we can to try and improve that situation and to make it better for the animals and for human beings. We were very struck that during the COVID period, we started to get questions from people asking us, not as they usually do, to reassure us that animals can be removed, but to reassure them that animals were being used to develop medicines, because there was so much speculation that vaccines were not being properly safety tested during that period. So there's, it's the audience we're talking to does not necessarily have the background assumptions that we think they have. If there's no more questions, Charlotte, I guess back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, John. That was great. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. I hope you found the session as informative and valuable as I have. Thank you.
Thanks for your patience.
Yes, apologies again for our technical difficulties at the start. There will be a follow-up email later today, but just to say that this session will be made available in due course, along with a copy of our first session, which was What is Public Engagement? In the email, I'll also be sharing a short survey about your experience. These sessions are completely flexible to the needs and interests of our community, so we'd really appreciate any feedback that you can give. And finally, in case today's session has sparked any engagement ideas for you, there is just over a week remaining to apply for our engagement grant, which offers anywhere from £250 to £2,000 for the development of in-person or digital engagement and outreach activities that will reach a variety of public audiences. So just to flag that. And with that, thank you all again for joining us, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day.
Thanks, Charlotte. Thank you, everybody.